Introduction Battle. It was a year of watching the battle up close. Instead of a fight focused on the disease, it was also taking place around Guru while he slept. By the time I got the call, "You need to come to the hospital," my nerves were already tight. The 10-minute drive to the hospital's ICU seemed like hours, with me dreading worse news waiting there. To add to the drama, my car radio was airing the crazy and conspiratorial rumors floating around the situation, which I was in no condition to defend against. Guru certainly wasn't. Not once he went into a coma, after a year-long fight with cancer so aggressive that it came out of nowhere and finished up fast. Instead of playing his music, the radio was playing into the lies and gossip like Guru and Solar had a violent and abusive relationship. Circumstances around Guru's death were suspicious, and that's why he got sick out of nowhere. Solar is keeping Guru's family away from him. Moment of truth. Guru is in bad shape, unkempt, and nobody is taking care of him. Solar forged Guru's signature and took over everything to steal his music. And other outrageous and salacious rumors. Guru decided, when he was beginning treatment, that he would have to address professional issues with ex-partnerships and other matters that had turned negative. He never planned for anybody to swing so low. By the time the rumors got worse, he had already slipped into a coma, and anything he felt needed addressing if things got worse, we covered in advance legally. I decided to keep the negative action away from him as he got sicker, knowing he needed to focus on healing. Only later was I able to unpack some of the nonsense circulating. Talk that I not only abused him, but forced Guru to tour instead of seeking medical help. That I took over control of his social media and personal email communications. That I was deeply in debt and so was hijacking his music. It was all a tirade of insults and accusations that made a bad situation worse. Was there time to defend us both right there in the thick of it? Not really. It was enough to wrap my head around one of my best friends dying. None of the people pointing the fingers knew half of Guru's story. They knew his music, they knew what they thought was his personality, but few understood his evolution over the years. They didn't stick around to watch him put down the bottle, and the heavy partying that went with it, or become a vegetarian. They missed a critical juncture during their years of estrangement from him that made it look to me like they didn't know the man in his last years. Not like those of us there every day. The key family members who could say they knew him were not the ones spreading the rumors. Instead, the ones he had virtually no contact with in his last years, which surfaced after the fact, were the primary cause of much of that talk. It's been over 7 years since that time, and while the finger pointing has let up, the effects of it still linger. It hangs. Moment of truth around any Google search about Guru's life and death and adds a stink to an otherwise incredible trajectory of a genius rap star. In reintroducing to this generation the impact and importance of his musical catalog, these untrue bits of history clog up the flow of information about him, and his truth isn't told. I want the fans to get behind his rise to fame, our true relationship, and the music that came out of it in his last days. I do realize this means marching through some old bullshit to get to the clearing. Boston born as Keith Elam, Guru gifted unlimited rhymes universal, and his talents made him into an acclaimed rapper and producer, named by the source as number 30 of top 50 lyricists of all time just for a start. Respected for both the work he accomplished as the founder of Gang Starr and his own critically successful solo projects like the Jazzmatazz Volumes, he was by all rights a star in the game. His lyrical gift spoke to an entire hip-hop generation that would have heard even greater music from him had the worst of disasters not hit. Now he was a sick man, vilified in the media and unable to speak at all. At the heart of the rumors, you could find a few of Guru's estranged family members who took their griefs to the media to stir up outright lies. This looks bad from any point of view because family should be a part of the medicine that helps a sick man heal. Why would I prevent that? What would I have gained from isolating him? I was a medical proxy, appointed by him, and I was too busy processing what all I needed to do next if his condition turned worse. In responding to my friend as he had asked me to, I took care of his business. I knew I had to call his father and speak to him, which I did. All of it ended up as fruitless efforts, as it turned into the worst day anybody could imagine. I knew I could lose somebody who was like family to me, a true brother, and that he was in dire straits. Plus, the weight of the very thing that I was entrusted to take care of, his legacy, was now being put into a negative light. All of that was something I had no experience dealing with at the time. I possessed no knowledge of how to tell the other side of the story against a scandal-hungry media machine. Certainly not to the hip-hop media, which was so negatively obsessed with the gossip side, to put it mildly. This situation was like giving them the dirty food you feed a pig. The very thing that they thrived on is what those rumor mongers cooked up for them. Whatever I had to say about taking care of a brother I loved as he battled a horrible disease, or how two friends were just trying to hold their heads like men do in a terrible situation like that, was ignored. The lies and the filth became the order of the day even before Guru even went into his coma. Once it got truly malicious, and once he started worsening, I did keep all that nasty drama away from him, but never his friends, family, or anyone else that wanted to see him at that time, despite their lies to the contrary. At the hospital, standing over Guru's bed in the ICU unit, what was going through my mind the most is how much his legacy meant to him. In his better days, when writing his life story out, we were both optimistic that it was going to be a story of him beating the cancer, and one he told himself. When it came down to the worst-case scenario, he knew it would at least be me writing it. "If you end up telling my story, it means I didn't make it," he said point blank one day. He gave me what he wanted to say, like a message in a bottle that I had to deliver, regardless. I knew I would have to tell it as it was told to me and as I witnessed it. Even with tears in my eyes, I thought that his legacy couldn't die with the man, or in a sea of lies. This was an arrangement we had in place for a year, with me as his legal proxy with the hospitals and doctors. As sole CEO of 7 Grand Entertainment and everything we built together over the years, my role was discussed and we were clear. This was from when he was first diagnosed. We agreed that this would be the best way. Any family or friends who surfaced afterward would have to be questioned as to where they were when he got the news, when he did the chemo, when he had the surgery, and when he knew he would need a proxy in the first place. Before the coma. The first day the bad news dropped, when he was in his right, but frightened mind, who did he call? Long before he got so debilitated, why did he not appoint them specifically, legally, and without a doubt in anyone's mind before considering me? Me, an interloper in their eyes I guess, had no rights to this position, but a judge would later decide otherwise. It's how I'm able to tell this story freely. Obviously, such talk was reckless and very detrimental to Guru's peace and ability to heal, so I started filtering a lot of it before he slipped into the coma. It certainly weighed on me that this whole media situation was something that I was going to have to deal with at some point on my own. At the same time, dealing with the reality that more than likely my friend was not going to make it. All this also sat on my heart even while all the talk was going down. In the back of my mind, I hoped that he could win his battle, but listening to the doctors and the nurses, it didn't seem very promising, and looking at him certainly didn't. While in the intensive care unit, he was indeed in bad shape. Nobody was risking infection to cut toenails or trim facial hair. Nobody was concerned with any of that. They were still trying to save his life. While he healed, something neither of us could foresee was the people who would start attacking me because Guru left me in charge of everything. Some people were obviously very unhappy with that, and willing go to any lengths to derail me, even at the cost of Guru's reputation and musical legacy. Their objective seemed mainly to prevent me from carrying out what he asked me to do, and this book is a big part of fulfilling that. My role that day after the phone call from the hospital was as Guru's appointed healthcare proxy. The person who he put in charge of things so he could focus on wellness. One of the people who had been there from some of the heights of his musical career through the lows of his drinking and diagnosis. From struggling through treatment on into those times when he couldn't make decisions. When he was well enough after his diagnosis and just sitting around worried about money, we went on the road so he could stay motivated. The stretches between treatment, the period after he was diagnosed, and before he got worse, he wanted nothing more than to keep bringing the music. He needed the love of his fans in those days. When I read how Charlie Murphy, Clarence Clemens, and many others kept working up to their last days, I look back and understand it even better. He knew that I supported whatever he wanted. Every time he had hospitalizations or anything seriously going on with the doctors, that was my role for him so he could focus on his life. You ask your homie who's been in the thick of it throughout to do that for you, and suddenly you're both gay? The need for the negative has overpowered a great musical legacy far too long, and his name and his son's name don't deserve it. Some were looking for a negative in the situation maybe because they weren't called in for this role. If he had wanted it different, I would have never been there. The simplest way to look at it is how these lies were directed at a man who was not able to defend himself. I have never seen that happen to any other artist with his level of fame, ever. That once a man was gone they could continue to defame him with reckless rumors. Every accusation raised was unfounded and unsubstantiated at all levels, yet I know that every man deserves a moment of truth. The fact that Guru's legacy would be mired in all that muck, not to mention my reputation, was not something he could predict, but he sensed enough to forewarn me and verbally discuss problems to come in writing. Thus, the now infamous letter that was Guru's final word on certain matters. It was his posthumous statement, because of the conversation about if he didn't make it, that we had when he was well enough to consider the ramifications. If I would be the last man standing in the battle, then I needed some ammunition. Not just his words, but all the legal documents that supported and eventually armed me for the fight. When his statement was released, instead of liberating us both from the drama and the haters, it ignited another maelstrom with me in the middle. Read On the Air with Sway, on the highest viewed MTV News episode of that year. Guru's letter said, "I do not wish my ex-DJ to have anything to do with my name, likeness, events, tributes, etc. connected in any way to my situation, including any use of my name or circumstance for any reason, and I have instructed my lawyers to enforce this. I had nothing to do with him in life for over 7 years and wanted nothing to do with him in death. Solar has my life story and is well informed on my family situation, as well as the real reason for separating from my ex-DJ. The cowardly haters and rumor mongers, instead of addressing the facts or credibility of the contents of the letter, replaced it with nonsensical insults, such as, 'That's some bullshit. Solar is hip-hop's greatest villain,' on some non-credible and sleazy hip-hop website that nobody paid attention to but underground weirdos. But somehow now these sites set the tone for my career and Guru's life and legacy. Ridiculous. I just said my piece. When I tried to use the media to try to deliver my truth, on outlets such as hiphop.com, XXL, or The Source or MTV, it was lost in the sea of whack sites delivering what people wanted out of the story titillation. I couldn't give them that, but I could finish delivering the message he sent. If it were set to be a rumble in the jungle, then my ability to knock out the lies would need spiritual courage to protect me in the ring in the fight of my life. Behind Gur's unfinished chapters of life hangs mysteries and questions that sound like the background of a thriller. Everything from what were the circumstances behind Gangstarr breaking up to murders around the Gangstarr camp, and police investigations into what Guru knew about it, even murder attempts on his own life. I can only raise more questions in some areas, and lay down the facts I know in others. It had been a long battle. The man who fought it the hardest died unaware that his legacy as a musician, and as a man, would be threatened even after his death. He would need others to battle the effect of fading into obscurity as just another bygone hip-hop maestro rip homie, gone too soon. He put out a massive volume of music just to defy obscurity, and he told his story in his lyrics, in his interviews, and to his friends and brothers, like me. This brings it all together for his fans. These events set up the next chapters of my life with an indication that it was going to be hard, and in fact, I was feeling like Muhammad Ali facing a crowd of George Foremans with no gloves. Time, and the need for justice means you go on and fight anyway. Whether or not Guru died in a sea of controversy, he did so with a prolific catalog of life-changing music that even this new generation can grow from. This book sets the stage for both his life story and his lyrical messages to be heard as his final moment of truth. Chapter 1: Code of the Streets. What does hip-hop look like when it grows up? It looks like me and Guru and all those other dudes that caught the scene at its purest. It just so happened that our generation created the genesis of the genre. We see now every later generation using elements of what originated before them in one way, shape, form, or another. The difference was we weren't mimicking any other generation or style, we were taking everything and creating fresh. From the clothes, to the language, to the dance, to our relationships and even religion, if you want to call what we were dealing with that, although we didn't. The backdrop to what influenced Guru's trajectory, as well as my own, was a unique time in history and like no other in hip-hop. It gives texture to how rappers today stand on the shoulders, as we did, of those who built the game from scratch. No story about a hip-hop legend would be complete without a picture of the genre and how it inspired his life. Sociopolitically, we had music as the sound behind our uprisings and revolts that weren't so much publicized, but they existed. There were lines of separation that we didn't cross, and we didn't allow anybody else to cross. Some of that is expressed when you see the battle raps between one borough and the next, Queens vs the Bronx and so on. But that was who we were, how we believed and how we lived. These were unspoken codes of the streets: how you dressed, what you listened to musically, how you rode, all told a story. When it comes to the influences of hip-hop at its beginning, me and Guru's stories are no different than many artists. I didn't come out of nowhere and start out in infamy. I didn't roll into the last year of Guru's life and take over. Coming into our introduction, I had already built my career and so had he, but it wasn't planned as work or targeted for fame. It was what we lived, as I'll explain. First, understand, as our friendship grew into a brotherhood, we started businesses, put out music, and toured the world. Some of the wildest times of my life came from those shows in foreign countries, catching all the energy we could throw at them. Before we got there, we started out in our respective worlds, getting crafted into musicians in our own right. To understand the later music we made and the basis of our relationship as friends and as business partners, you'd have to consider us as individual artists coming together. Then maybe in the end, you will see how the road we traveled up to that point could forge such a friendship, and understand why our close dealings could be so misunderstood. One thing that stood out over the years of my friendship with Guru was how parallel our lives were growing up, even coming from our different environments. There were the heavy influences of hip-hop and jazz as the bonding common denominator between us. Hip-hop was kind of an amalgamation of music that I already listened to, except for maybe jazz. I grew up in Coney Island and spent time in upstate New York in primarily white neighborhoods, so I had a multicultural upbringing. Prior to that, I moved from the Bushwick and Bedford, Stuyvesant areas of Brooklyn, which was at that time predominantly black. It was an eclectic mix of sounds I got from each area I spent time in growing up. Hip-hop was delivered to us at that point as a DJ scratching two records between two Technique turntables and usually a Numark or Gemini mixer. Most of the breaks that were being used were really drum or rock breaks. Since Coney Island was musically very multicultural, the break records that would be sought after and being scratched were records I was already familiar with. Mainly because, by then, I'd been playing drums since I was 7 and listening to a lot of rock, R&B. This gave me another dimension of appreciation because I understood who Aerosmith, the rock group, was besides just the break. And then there was R&B, funk, and soul that every black person's experience in that time included, from Earth, Wind and Fire, and Cool, and the Gang, to the Commodores. All the classic R&B stuff. And of course, the jazz. Which I wasn't familiar with until I started cutting up or scratching the jazz breaks along with the rock and the funk. That was my introduction to jazz without really paying attention to it. Over in Boston, Guru was getting immersed in it daily. Overall, this was the soundtrack to my life. One that even included Latin music and stuff they called disco, even though some of it really wasn't. Like soul macasa, that was Afro-funk at its best but got lumped into that category of disco. Yet with all that musical exposure at a young age, I couldn't say that any of it directly inspired me. In other words, I wasn't aspiring to be a producer based on this vast exposure to music early on. I wasn't aspiring to be somebody making money off hip-hop either. As far as we could see, it was the culture that we lived. It wasn't something that we tried to see if we could make money or a career off back then. Even the ones who were making money early on, Grandmaster Flash, Cold Crush Brothers, Kool Herc, and all those cats, they weren't representing it like they were in it for the money. They were repping the culture itself. Those like me, and most of my peers, just followed and lived the life. The music and lifestyle had innately prepared me for a career as a producer and as an artist later. Meanwhile, that was a life that Guru was fascinated with in Boston. He was getting it retroactively, not in real time but in bits and pieces. This was before the internet where music and styles spread in minutes. He was growing more aware of the culture. At some point, he started to make pilgrimages to New York to get clothes and records, and to get a taste of the city where it was being created. It was where hip-hop was at its purest. He was going to school and aspiring to be in the culture or have some elements of that world incorporated into his life. At the same time, I was living it but also doing what he was doing, going to school and preparing myself for adulthood. At the same time, by living in such multicultural areas as Coney Island, I was exposed to the differences behind the music they played in each household: black, white, Latin, Caribbean, and so on. In this early exposure, my musical future was being shaped without me even knowing it, and so was Guru's. Because he also had a deep background knowledge of music, his in jazz, and a lot of the early breaks that were cut up were jazz breaks. And that was my first introduction to the genre. Jazz and disco breaks gave us sounds from prominent jazz musicians who I then had the pleasure to work with, like Niles Rodgers in Brazil. To meet him was like meeting a hero. Good Times is probably the most famous break for DJs of all time. It was the party rocker regardless. Grandmaster Flash used it for the first beginnings of hip-hop records. So, my musical future was shaped without me even knowing it. I really wasn't aspiring to be a hip-hop star, because there was no such thing at that time. I went to high school in Harlem, even though I was living in Bushwick. I had to travel to Manhattan to go to Brandeis High School, and at Brandeis, I was being exposed to a whole different approach to hip-hop. There you had Grandmaster Flash, and Bambaataa, and Bill Blass, and all these cats were throwing jams at the Armory and different places around Manhattan, Harlem, and the Bronx. They had a whole different aspect to hip-hop in terms of monetizing it. They were doing jams and making money and selling tapes with the jams. It was a much more organized, structured way of approaching it. Then you start to see that the break dancers became famous. These things were equally happening in Bushwick and happening in Bed-Stuy, but not happening in the same way. There, the scene wasn't really about money so much as it was about the purity of the culture. The jams were being thrown in the parks, basements, private houses. So, they didn't have the big money-making element to it as much as now. There were bigger jams that were being thrown in which they were charging admissions. With Spinderella and Grand Wizard Theodore as well as others, but not as big as what Kool Herc, Bambaataa, and other luminaries from the uptown scene were doing. But all of it was that sense of a special, new culture. Back then there was really no sense of animosity or jealousy, only healthy competition for artists. I traveled to party after party and enjoyed the scene by trading tapes with my friends until I started to really get my DJ chops together. I was in my teen years when I put together a couple of hip-hop groups in Bedford-Stuyvesant and Bushwick before I moved back Coney Island, and put a group together out there. But again, I did it mostly out of love for the culture and love of the music with no career aspect. That element didn't really appear to me to become viable until we saw Run DMC, and before Run DMC you had the Sugar Hill Gang, but it was never really shown like those guys were living the rock star life. Run DMC was like the first hip-hop group where you started to see them living larger than life, emulating the ballers from the hood. What they were emulating, I'd already seen back in the day from the Hustlers. They were getting it in, and Run DMC just emulated their style of how they were doing things and looking. Then a lot of those cats who was hustling big were G's, so they had their own style that extended from going back to the beginnings of hip-hop coming out of the 5% nation, down to even the classic b-boy stance. When you see the b-boys with their arms folded and they're standing in a square, that's something that the G's would do to represent our knowledge and understanding of our teachings, and that could be shown and proved just by how we stand in a square. Then you see the way the Adidas were worn with no shoelaces, the Adidas suit with the Kangol hats and the chains. That was stick-up kid territory, because when I was coming up, if you really weren't thorough, you couldn't walk around the hood wearing all that. You were gonna be the victim of a stick-up kid. Interestingly enough, Guru did one of his hit songs about a stick-up kid, a story I knew intricately. I got out of high school by graduating early and received the scholarship to go to NYU Medical School. At the time, around 1980, the hip-hop scene was still viewed by those outside it as occupied by thugs, stick-up kids, gangsters, and criminals. That's what the police would identify when they saw somebody dressed in the standard hip-hop gear of the time, the Adidas suits, chains, gold watches, gold teeth, candle hats, the whole style. Which wasn't completely wrong, because like I said before, to be dressed like that in the hood, you have to have respect. If you didn't, you weren't going to be able to represent that, unless you had a certain level of street credibility or street respect. It was an unspoken code, but a loud one. When I got into medical school at New York University Medical School, it was the introductory program to a career as a doctor in medicine and different fields that were open. There were different studies you'd have to go through to achieve that. You looked around and everybody there looked like more or less normal kids, like geeks. Back when I was young, we called them Herbs or Vics. The professors and the people in the medical school there found me to be unique. Somebody that they had never encountered before from the street, that was very articulate and to some level up to their caliber. At least high enough that could achieve a medical degree. To show you that meant little in the socio-political climate, back in Bushwick where I still lived while going to school, I hopped the turnstile and a cop grabbed me. He snatched me over and took me inside his little room where there was another cop. They asked me for my ID and I gave it to them. Meanwhile they were approaching me just like a regular criminal. To them I was just a thug like they had snatched a million times before, and it was just business as usual. And then the one cop looks at my ID and goes to the other guy, "Bob, you're never gonna believe this." And the other cop looks at him like, "What? This kid is going to be a doctor, he's in medical school." The look on those cops' faces. Like, "What? Are you kidding me?" The other cop goes, "Let me see that." They both looked at me puzzled and asked, "You're gonna be a doctor?" And I nodded, "Yeah, pretty much." And they're like, "Take your ID and get the hell out of here." They were just laughing, like they got such a kick out of it, or like they'd never experienced anything like that. Many of us were thugs and woods and stick-up artists before we were artists, but this time they got to be wrong. New York City subways were basically lawless back then. All the trains were covered with graffiti, even though most people consider that to be one of the most artistic periods of New York in terms of the graffiti, and I thought it made the trains and train stations look even better. Unique. White people did not even travel certain train lines, at least not at nighttime. The stick-up kids and criminals ruled the roost. We used to smoke weed and drink beer on the trains, and getting hassled by the cops really didn't happen that often. Most of the time, if they were trying to catch you, what they would do is get a cop to dress up like a bum. You could see that it was a regular person dressed up like a bum, and they would have them sit on the stairs and have money hanging out of his pocket. It would be a ridiculous sum of money too that a bum really wouldn't have, but they thought it would catch the kids that weren't hip. They'd snatch the money and then get grabbed. The movie, The Warriors, was an excellent depiction of New York in my youth and during the time Guru became fascinated with it. Interestingly, the movie was inspired by an interview done for an article about the gangs and, as the youngest member of the Warriors, I then inspired the youngest character portrayed in the movie. Brought up in and around it, I knew all the people the characters were based on. It comes the closest to how it was for us at that time. Ultimately, I decided medical school wasn't for me and I switched colleges from NYU to Long Island University and switched my major to communications. This is around the same time that Spike Lee was making She's Gotta Have It, and by now, in the Brooklyn cultural scene, hip-hop had grown up a little bit. You were starting to see the culture become more dominant. You can see now that this is going to be a worldwide phenomenon and a dominant force in the world. So, it's not as underground as it was by this time. You've heard me address myself and my friends as G's, gods, and if you are not familiar with the origins of the 5% Nation, or NOGE, the Nation of Gods and Earths, you won't understand the reference or how influential it was to become to hip-hop music. If you've seen Spike Lee's movie Do the Right Thing, you see the stoops and get the atmosphere that is pretty much unchanged from that time I spent my youth there. It still looks architecturally the same, although the racial makeup and the economics have changed. Then, it was all black and the brownstones had a different vibe from Bushwick. Even though it was close and similar to the neighborhood where everybody knew everybody. Where for the most part people were working and trying to keep their heads above water. Much like the movie, Crooklyn, which captures a good slice of that. Bushwick and Bed-Stuy had an insulated black feel and it was very empowered. You had the Ansars, who are now in the Hebrew Israelites, that controlled large swaths of the area. To see those brothers in how they conducted themselves and how they espoused their beliefs and their religion at that time, it was something that had not been before. We had the Nation of Islam. In Bushwick and Bed-Stuy you not only had the Ansars, there were the 5%ers, which was who I rolled and dealt with. Each had their own character and flavor, while Message to the Black Man, by Elijah Muhammad, was well read. I couldn't really say that I knew many people that were on top of things or with it that didn't read Message to the Black Man. All these different powerful black culture movements were new to me. It had a powerful influence on my direction as a man and as a young G. You had the gang era, then after that you even had some level of prominence of the G's in Coney Island. Such as Shatik, who was Stephen Marbury's older brother. I remember Stephen from a little kid because me and his brother were good friends. He played ball at Lincoln High School where I went to school at that time and played. We were a crew, and no matter where I went, I dressed and accorded myself a certain way, so those that were in that position would approve. Meaning I could do that without anybody trying to rob me or harass me. I could move in peace and in my own autonomy, but at the same time be seen and heard. While I was at NYU, Guru was at Morehouse pursuing his college degree and absorbing the other knowledge while there that would later influence his life and music. For me, I was still DJing and working with some rappers, but nobody was serious, despite at that time seeing Run DMC, Slick Rick, and those guys doing it big. That was the beginnings of real money being made in hip-hop, and it being a career application. I started growing in that direction, and moved from downtown Brooklyn back to Coney Island, made friends with a singer who knew the producer of the Jungle Brothers' first album, and worked with Tony Dick out of their studio on Coney Island. They also did Inspector Gadget over there. In hanging out with these guys, I got to see the mechanics of what the next level of hip-hop was. From being introduced to Roland drum machines and in particularly EMU SP1200, which was the first dominate modern sampling drum machine. Before that you had the TR-808. That's when I started looking at the new future of hip-hop and thought to myself, wow, you don't need a band no more, you don't need musicians. Even though I am a musician to the bone, I was looking at this saying, wow, all you need is a keyboard, a sampling drum machine, and you're good to go. And that's exactly what I did. These guys influenced me to the point of making that purchase of the drum machines and samplers to start producing demos along with my DJing. That was really the beginnings of Solar. Later, once I was out in Coney Island, I set up a studio and my beats started to get known. People were starting to hear about my work and contacting me. Some of those individuals were famous. One of the biggest acts at that time was High C from the group US3. Interestingly, because that was a hip-hop jazz group that had a big hit in the 90s with Cantaloupe. That to me was an amazing factoid that me and Guru both used to trip on once we met, that he'd say again and again, "Wow, you worked with US3, since around that time Guru was doing Jazzmatazz Volume 1. Between US3 and probably Diggable Planets, they have the two most notable hip-hop jazz singles of the 90s. But Guru had the most influential albums, with Jazzmatazz Volumes #1-3, with number 3 being at the end of the decade, in 1999. I also worked with Dead Prez for a minute, when they were first coming up and got signed to Loud as well as the Bushwackas and other groups. Some of them made it, many of them didn't. Some of them should have. I had groups from Jersey and some groups from upstate New York, where I ended up relocating to Rockland County, my adopted home outside of Brooklyn. We lived right down the block from Pete Rock in Spring Valley and just a few towns from Marley Marl. When I moved to Rockland County, I kept the studio in Brooklyn and would work out of multiple other spots. Eventually I just bought the house in Rockland and made that my full-time residence with a studio there. Once I started producing artists that had major label deals, then I could put out my own independent records on my label and a couple of ventures I started. I also could do some major business in Europe and put some records over there. At the time, the hip-hop scene was healthy, so you could sell independently anywhere from 0 to 100,000 copies. Decent money could be made if you were selling records, enough money to pay your bills and keep your head above water anyway. Which I could do. My records sold very well. The record that I put out 2 years ago was of material from my back catalog from this time. Fans weren't much familiar with a lot of my earlier catalog work, so I put out Solar Dark Side of the Sunday. The work that I was doing at that time was really starting to get me around to different cities and states, even different countries. The first time I went to Europe, I hit Paris and all through France, on into Spain. That was my first trip overseas for music. I had friends in the States that were from France, and at that time it had a healthy hip-hop scene there. So, I was working with them and a lot of major international artists that were doing well. By now, Guru was in Brooklyn, because he had already made the move from Boston to New York. Once he arrived, he started working on his music, building his audience, and shopping a record deal. At this point we still didn't know each other, but it was the lifestyle of hip-hop that would allow us to eventually meet, due to its networking and socializing function. Hip-hop was such a part of the social fabric of our lives, that it became a key way to come together and kick it. We smoked weed, drank beer, made mixtapes, and went out to jams. We dressed a certain way and watched for who had the new sneakers, the new chain or watch. I didn't get as advanced with the cars and motorcycles until I got older because my hustle wasn't on that high level, but other dudes I knew did. By watching the styles and the material come-ups of your peers, you fell into a socializing and mildly competitive arena. When me and Guru eventually hung together with other friends, we were all absorbing and then bouncing the culture off one another. It's interesting that me and Guru connected on a similar level. No managers or agents put us together. It was organic and steeped in our familiarities of hip-hop jazz music. But, to meet somebody like Guru who was doing it and had done it well by that point, it was life-changing. Chapter 2. Step in the arena. When Guru started to tell me about his life story and how it was for him growing up in Boston, I realized that a lot of things he experienced, I was doing too, even though we came from the vibes of two different cities. Still, A lot of the things that I was experiencing in New York were things that he admired and wished in some way that he would have had growing up. How many hardcore fans of the hip-hop that lived outside the epicenter of that culture didn't wish to be more in it, or have it more prominent in their cities? I've said we liked the same types of music, and yet he was exposed more heavily to jazz, funk, and R&B and at a younger age. His home life and his family upbringing were certainly different, with a father who was a judge and his mother a teacher/educator. He was raised with 2 sisters and a brother. From the way he told it, there was jockeying for the father's affection and approval, as is the case in some families. Guru was a wild child, he has said. He tended to dance to his beat, and that caused friction between him and his father. He was getting into trouble in school, fighting and hanging out with rough kids. His mother was a very sweet and loving woman. I loved her like a mother, she loved me like another son, and his father had accepted me like another son at one point as well. This was obviously after Guru, and I got to know each other as adults. Guru loved the music. He loved entertaining, and he loved the girls. His great joy was being the center of attention. He also liked to hang out with kids from the projects, although coming from an upper, middle-income family. He would have appeared rich compared to some of the kids in Boston, but because he lived close enough to the hood, not too close, he had friends that he tended to gravitate towards from there. Pretty much what I did at that age regarding hanging out, listening to music, getting high and so on, he was doing under very close and watchful supervision in a different environment. He often said that Boston was racist and that it was a tense environment growing up. I never really knew anybody from Boston, so I didn't know how racist it was, but according to him, it was bad. Like him getting beat up by the cops and white kids bad. Getting chased by these kids influenced him as a teenager and as a man, even to the point when I first got to know him. You know how friendships develop, don't you? The long-lasting kind. You have that homie for life that borders on brotherhood because you click better than some of your other friends, who are cool but not like a brother. The movies that he liked, I liked. The blaxploitation films, he knew all of them as I did. Of course, here in New York, we used to go to 42nd Street to the Deuce to see those movies, and when he started making his pilgrimages to New York, he was going there too, so we had that in common. He loved it there in the same way I loved it too. I spent much more time there than he did. Actually, as an odd fact, it was a store called Downstairs Records on 42nd Street and 8th Avenue. And that was the first store in the world where DJs used to go to buy breakbeats. Like the actual record the breakbeats were on, and that was their specialty. A tiny, almost closet-sized record shop selling the breaks that were the foundation of hip-hop. Then you had, of course, a whole series of breakbeat records that came out after that, but before you had to go there in person physically to buy breaks and then to buy the first hip-hop records made from them. That was like the first store in the world to sell Grandmaster Flash. There was also a place in New York called Orchard Street down by Delancey where we used to go to buy clothes. That's where you bought your hip-hop gear, and that's where it all started. The Adidas suits, the Lee suits, the Kangals, British Walkers, sheepskin coats, Playboy shoes, Pumas, gold chains, and teeth. It was all right there. If you ever watched the old breakbeat movie, Wild Style, you'll see the sweatshirts with the names ironed on. Guru was steady hitting Delancey and Orchard Street. He started hitting 42nd Street as a teenager. He had family in Brooklyn, so I guess that helped to facilitate his little pilgrimages to get his records and clothes and get his fix on the culture. The fact that we liked the same movies was the surface. I could understand his views about racism, and his feelings of dislike of Caucasians he met growing up. The things that he saw in Boston and the brutality that he had felt as a teenager drove that opinion he had. He'd mentioned one time the cops brought him home to his father like all beat up and bloody. Obviously, a very traumatic experience considering the whole aspect of the judge's son being brought home by the police in that condition. From Guru's accounts, His father didn't fully sympathize with his position but wasn't happy that his son was beaten up. It was a lot that he had to deal with, like times when people called the house with death threats against his father. That they're going to kill this nigga, or he's one dead nigger, etc. Perhaps because he was in some form of politics as well as being a prominent black judge. All these things had affected him profoundly. He told me of Malcolm X coming from there and having an aunt that was a member of the Nation of Islam, which exposed him to some of her beliefs and her teachers. He also had got a chance to read Message to the Black Man, or excerpts according to him of that time. These were the outlooks and his characteristics that went into making him who he became as a man and an artist. He was certainly relatable from my perspective and conversational about things I was into, like the movies Black Caesar, Shaft and Superfly. We could sit down and talk in depth about the characters. When we started traveling later, we had the full collection of blaxploitation movies, and when we had to fly, we were constantly watching them. We never watched the films on the flight. We always had our own rewatched like classics. We were deeply into it. These were the kinds of things that he looked forward to when he was a kid, and I used to go crazy looking forward to as well. I was into the kung fu flicks a little bit more than him, but he was into the standards like Bruce Lee, so that was cool. Even though music was the main part of our clicking, it was an easy friendship that grew over time and allowed the music to happen big enough for the world to see. Being able to sit down and talk about our youth coming up and have all these things in common certainly made for a better union. But at the same time, we understood each other in that we could see the world from different places, him from Boston and me New York. We had the same outlook on the world when he would tell me how he felt about Malcolm X being returned and the rise of black nationalism through Farrakhan. All these things meant something to me. It was during his experiences attending Morehouse that he had gotten close to one of the G's who went there that helped further his 5% Nation teachings. Whereas I got it young in the streets of Bushwick, and that carried with me back to Coney Island and for the rest of my life. My levels of study were much higher than Guru's because of the classes in Harlem. I was getting to know G's from all over Brooklyn and other boroughs and from Medina, Pelham, Mecca. I was well-traveled and well-known amongst my peers. It was something that he looked up to and admired in me. He didn't have that type of freedom in his household growing up. When he talked about his relationship with his brother and sisters, he made clear he was cool with his brother, but him and one sister never got along. She was, to hear him tell it, a snitch trying to cause him problems to make herself look better to the father. They never had a good close relationship, even as children growing up, and she could have a violent temperament too. Guru managed to dip most of the time, but I think from what he said the brother caught a couple of beatings from her. If I understood correctly, she knocked some teeth out of more than one mouth in those days. His brother is a nice guy. I've met him and his wife. He was teaching at one of the big Ivy League schools and was always described as a wonderful brother by Guru. I can't lie though, the stories about the sister sounded like hell on wheels. Guru went to college, but I think that if it wasn't for his father, he would not have, to be honest. To hear him tell it, he tried to live in both worlds by going to keep the father happy. That's why he went to an all-black one as well, he has said. Once he graduated, that's when things started to get hectic. Where he was getting more serious about his music, and when hip-hop was just seeing money made by Slick Rick and so many others. That's when the videos were starting to get more play and making every wannabe artist crave it. Everybody wanted to step into the arena at that point. By then, Guru had started going to concerts and shows, but with his father being 150% against him and his music. The judge wasn't trying to hear it at all. They were constantly bumping heads, and it finally got to the point where his father pointed out, "You can't be doing that in my house." His father didn't want any parts of the dress, the talk, any association or identification with hip-hop culture. It was that time that it started getting media attention, and that was all negative. At that point in the early 80s, rappers were essentially drug dealers and criminals in the worldview, Remember the stick-up kids? I believe that's why Mike Tyson got caught up in that legal action and media slander, because he was repping the hip-hop culture. The mainstream media just wouldn't say anything good about it. They portrayed us all as drug dealers, gangsters, thugs, and everything else negative. Which wasn't true at all for the majority in the industry, but that was the public persona, all bad, until they started making money off those very images years later. Guru's father, being a judge, tuned right into it when his son started to dress and emulate hip-hop openly. Before, he was managing to dump his gear off at a friend's house and change before he got home, and he was more or less keeping it under wraps as a teen. When he came back from college, at that point there was no keeping anything under wraps. He was repping hip-hop, and that was it. For his father and him that wasn't mixing at all, so he packed his stuff and said, "I'm going to Brooklyn. I'm taking it to New York finally." He said his pops told him, "You're never going to be able to come back here," or something in the line of that. He said answered, "I'm not coming back." The sister was instigating with, "You're crazy," and sided with their father, adding, "You're never going to make it as a rapper." Guru took his bag, loaded up his hookter, and took his game to New York. He couch surfed from his people's house to other people's houses. Then he landed a little job and soon signed his first record deal. He pulled in enough money to rent a room in Brooklyn, down around Washington Street. He was getting it in. He started to meet some G's, getting his 5% connection solid. Before he came to New York, he was dabbling with forming his hip-hop identity, and so he started off with the name Keith E, and then he came up with Gangstarr, which is the one he brought with him. He got his first record deal under Gangstarr with an independent label called Wild Pitch. There he began work on his first album for that label, entitled No More Mr. Nice Guy. At the offices of the label, Guru was going through demo tapes and came across DJ Premier. This led eventually to him contacting Premier and arranging to meet in New York. After these two meetings, and clicking, they launched the beginnings of their professional relationship, and Gangstarr went from being Guru solo to being a group. The name Guru, he was using more as his attribute, which most people don't know. That's where they came up with the Gifted Universal Rhymes Unlimited, which was the acronym. But that wasn't the real acronym. It was God Universal Ruler Universal. I don't know how it got switched to the other one. I heard a few things, but I'm not positive. I just know that was the one that stuck. I think he used it in a rhyme or something. Guru and Gangstarr went on to leave Wild Pitch and sign a major recording deal, releasing their next 4 albums: Step Into the Arena, Chrysalis in 1990, Daily Operation in 1992 on ME/Chrysalis, Hard to Earn in 1994 on Chrysalis Erg, and Moment of Truth in 1998 on Virgin/Noah Tribe. Around the first release, Guru and Gangstarr started mixing it up in Brooklyn, with the different rap crews out at the time. Guru was dealing with DJs and whoever was making beats in the studios. Oddly enough, at that time he was going to a spot called Firehouse Studios in downtown Brooklyn that I was also going to, but we never met each other. A very notable studio, because some major early hip-hop hits came out of it, even though it was small and breaking all the rules for recording studios. From the way it was designed to the way he approached it. He had the Wu-Tang, who did their first album, in there. Also, Helter Skelter, Pushnikins, and even Dos EFX and Slick Rick did some stuff in there, and many other rap artists like MOP, who came from Coney Island. I knew them from seeing them, although we never hung out. Guru had 3 artists at the time that he was working with that were signed to him: Crumb Snatcher, Black Jesus, and a white kid from Canada, and that was also interesting. Guru had set up an independent label, Ill Kid Records, before I'd met him. I had independent record label ventures that were very successful. I set up my business model through independent distributors worldwide. I could control my profits and run a very tight ship with my releases and do bookings and so forth. One day, one of the G's who I was very good friends with was like we rocking with Guru, who is doing an independent record now. If you gonna be at the rally, which we call our Universal Parliament, I'll introduce you. I went to the rally since I always attend them anyway. That time Guru didn't come, but after that I managed to link up with him. In a downtown studio on 48th Street, we met and became fast friends. Just as soon as he and I started talking, we realized common things about each other. The only thing we didn't have in common was he liked to drink heavy drinking. I would take a few beers here or there. At the time I smoked weed, so I'd smoke weed and drink some beers, but that was the extent of it. Hindsight tells me he was an alcoholic back then. Still, the chemistry was there the instant we met, and it made our musical collaborations later magical. But first, we were just friends hanging out like it was done at that time. When I met Guru, he had just finished doing an independent record called Bald Head Slick and Dick Lick, and those artists I just mentioned were on the record, even did a little tour out in Europe to promote the record. But Guru was unhappy with the way the business went down off that record. He didn't feel that the deal went down properly or that it lived up to his understanding or hopes of what that relationship and that release would be. So, when we got together, that was another element of something that he wanted to do, was to launch a successful label, one that was going to change the world. The first time Guru told me, "Meet me at the studio," I didn't know of D&D Studios. I have never been there, but it had a little buzz behind it, being that Funk Master Flex had done a record up in there and I heard about it. The first time I got up there, I was like, this is cool. I mean, a nice studio. So big that I think it had 3 rooms, a pool table, and huge lounge area. Then they had a little record company set up in there called D&D Records. I was impressed. And there it looked like Premier ruled the roost, and it was his studio the way that things went down. Guru equally ruled the roost there also. We could also hang out there, eat, drink and smoke, and it's where we'd always meet up at the beginning of the night. This was around that time Guru was starting to do the Onerts. I was there right at the beginning of that all the way to the end when I toured with Gangstarr on it. I wrote some of the songs with Guru, being heavily involved in the recording and production. And when I say heavily involved, I mean I was there. Me and Guru, when we left the studios, we listened to the tracks and vocals and would go over certain things. When Guru would be doing his sessions, a lot of times, Premier wouldn't be there, so I'd produce the session with him. Not only for the Onerts, but also for the track we did for 8 Mile, the battle song, which was also done at D&D. It was a good experience, and the vibe was positive for everybody up there too. I mean, from LL Cool J, who would come through, to your regulars like Just Ice and Craig G, Fat Joe, the list goes on. It was cool to be there and meet these cats and smoke with them. As I said, it flies in the face of all the BS that was talked about out there, because this hanging and building went on for almost a year. Up there constantly, every night, it was never a problem, and I never a bad word between Premier and me or nobody else. I didn't carry any ill feelings. It was just dudes being cool and putting it in. By the time Guru and I got to know each other even better, we started out going to different parties together, and that was a whole other situation. We'd have tons of fun, and for the most part, even with his alcoholism, he kept it under control. It would only get out of hand once in a while, until he had stopped drinking. At one point, over time, our friendship was on the line. I put it to him, it's either the bottle or our friendship. I can't just stand and watch you kill yourself in pieces. I'm not, and I wouldn't do that for anybody. This is the route you got to go if it's that important to you. You'll have to do that on your own. You'll have to go solo with that. I can't be down. But at the beginning, he would have his alcohol like anybody else and would smoke, drink, and have a good time picking up chicks and doing what he did. We used to hit all the parties and all the clubs here in New York. Puff spot that he had over there, Cheetah, Apt, Suede and Lotus. Every time you turned around we were at another club. Sometimes 2 in a night. A lot of people just didn't understand that it was no real hard time between me and Gangstarr or the Gangstarr Foundation or anybody else connected to Premier or Guru back then. I was there with them. There was never a problem. We all hung out, chilled, laughed, talked, played pool, and otherwise kicked it around. It was all just